As of 2023, the United States held almost 1.8 million people in various types of detention facilities, including prisons, jails, correctional facilities, immigrant detention centers, civil commitment centers, and state psychiatric hospitals. This staggering figure represents the largest prison population in the world. Despite making up only a little over 4% of the global population, the United States accounts for approximately 20% of the world's prisoners. This discrepancy suggests that the U.S. must be addressing crime and punishment in a significantly different and perhaps flawed way. The roots of America's mass incarceration problem can be traced back to the declaration of the War on Drugs in the 1970s and the following implementation of harsher sentencing laws for less severe crimes. These policies, along with others, led to an unprecedented increase in the number of people being sentenced to prison for longer durations. The data reflects this trend. The incarceration rate surged from just over 0.1% in 1970 to around 0.45% by 2015. To manage the growing prison population and mitigate the financial burden of housing so many inmates, the U.S. turned to private prisons. While private prisons had existed in America before, their use expanded dramatically in the 1980s. The number of private prisons increased 16-fold from 1990 to 2010, generating over $3 billion in revenue annually. This surge was seen as a solution to both prison overcrowding and the high cost associated with public prison facilities. However, this reliance on private prisons introduced a new set of problems. The primary concern is that private prisons profit directly from the incarceration of people. Their business model is inherently tied to maintaining and increasing the prison population. As a result, these institutions have an interest in policies that sustain high incarceration rates. This conflict of interest raises significant ethical and practical questions about the role that private prisons can play in the prison system. Critics argue that the profit motive of private prisons leads to cost-cutting measures that can compromise the quality of care and conditions for inmates. Additionally, there's a concern that private prisons may lobby for harsher sentencing laws and policies that keep more people behind bars for longer periods, exacerbating the mass incarceration problem instead of alleviating it. As you can see, however, private prisons are not as widely used as some may think. Only around half of our states use private prisons to house prisoners, and many of those that do only keep a small percentage of inmates in these private prisons. Overall, the total private prison population makes up around 8% of the United States' total population of prisoners. This graph shows the total private prison population in the United States, which was less than 100,000 in 2022. With this information in mind, what is the Catholic Church's stance on private prisons? Are they ever justified, or should we eliminate all of them? According to the Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Church believes that actions taken by any force of authority must be rooted in the common good, or else they are not legitimate. Private prisons, however, enforce these obligations for profit rather than to serve the common good. The Catholic Church's teaching emphasizes the dignity of the human person and the need for societal structures, including in the penal system, to uphold this dignity. The compendium argues that the primary purpose of punishment are retribution, deterrence, and rehabilitation, with a strong emphasis on rehabilitation. This aligns with the Church's broader mission of mercy and restoration, aiming to reintegrate individuals into society as productive and moral members. In this context, the profit motive inherent in private prisons is questionable. The Church is wary of any system where financial incentives could undermine the moral aims of that system. Private prisons, driven by the need to maximize profit, are incentivized to cut costs in ways that can compromise inmate welfare, reduce opportunities for rehabilitation, and perpetuate a cycle of incarceration instead of breaking it. Furthermore, The Church is concerned about the justice of a system where incarceration becomes a way for private entities to generate revenue. This situation leads to conflicts of interest where policies that increase incarceration rates are favored over those that might better serve the common good, such as alternatives to imprisonment or reforms aimed at reducing the number of reoffenders. The USCCB says that each and every prisoner needs to have the ability to improve themselves through addiction treatment, offering skills necessary for integration, and helping them actually change their behaviors. However, these programs all cost money. These private prisons are motivated by profit, and spending money on properly funding these programs hurts their profit margins, disincentivizing them to actually aim for rehabilitation. Catholic social teaching also highlights the importance of justice and the preferential option for the poor. Many individuals in the prison system come from disadvantaged backgrounds, and a for-profit model can exacerbate their suffering and marginalization. The Church calls for systems that are just and equitable, which seek to uplift the marginalized rather than exploit their suffering for a profit. Given these principles, the Church generally opposes private prisons. Though ending private prisons alone will not end the problem our nation faces with mass incarceration, it is a necessary step to rooting out any potential for corruption in our prison system, and to ensure that the focus remains on justice and rehabilitation rather than profit or punishment. Some people disagree with this. City Journal disagrees that private prisons should be phased out for two big reasons. First is that many studies show essentially no difference in quality between the private and government-run prisons. Additionally, they analyzed recidivism rates, which is the rate at which former prisoners reoffend, and found that most studies revealed little to no difference between public and for-profit prisons on this measure. While this is a strong claim, it overlooks several critical issues. First, and mainly, the moral argument against private prisons extends beyond just the quality of care and recidivism rates. The fundamental problem is due to the profit motive inherently built into private prisons. These prisons are incentivized to cut costs and maximize occupancy, which can lead to neglect of inmate welfare and rehabilitation. Even if the quality of services were comparable, the profit-driven model inherently prioritizes financial gain over the well-being and rehabilitation of inmates, which is dangerous. Even further, the focus on quality and recidivism rates does not address the broader systemic issues associated with private prisons. The very existence of a for-profit prison system creates a financial incentive to maintain high incarceration rates, allowing these private prison corporations to influence policy through lobbying and to further perpetuate mass incarceration. This directly conflicts with the principles of justice and rehabilitation, which should be at the core of any prison system. The other main argument City Journal makes against the phasing out of private prisons is that they can serve as a useful tool for improving conditions within the correctional system. They argue that private prisons are able to innovate in ways that public prisons cannot, cutting costs and encouraging public facilities to keep up. They also point out that private correctional officers can be held personally liable for violating the civil rights of incarcerated individuals, unlike their government-employed counterparts, who often receive immunities. This, they argue, can make private prisons easier to hold accountable than state and federal bureaucracies. While this argument highlights some potential advantages of private prisons, the flexibility and potential for innovation touted by private prison advocates can often come at the expense of inmate welfare. The primary goal of private prisons is profit, which can lead to cost-cutting measures that undermine the quality of care and rehabilitation services. Innovations that are profit-driven rather than welfare-driven are unlikely to lead to substantial improvements in prison conditions. Moreover, the notion that private correctional officers are more accountable because they can be personally liable does not necessarily translate to better overall accountability. The for-profit nature of these prisons can lead to systemic issues where corporate interests overshadow the rights and well-being of inmates, which won't likely result in meaningful changes or improvements in conditions. Furthermore, the reliance on private prisons can divert attention from the need for reform within public correctional facilities. Instead of outsourcing the problem to private companies, resources and efforts should be focused on reforming public prisons to ensure they meet high standards of care, rehabilitation, and human rights. This approach aligns with the broader goals of justice and rehabilitation without introducing any ethical dilemmas associated with profit motives. Now that we understand the inherent issues in profiting off of incarceration, what are everyday people like you and me able to actually do about it? One impactful way you can make a difference is to donate to the ACLU. The ACLU is an organization whose goal is to fight for the civil rights of Americans. They work in courts as well as local communities to help address and fight against issues threatening our civil rights. They have created a campaign dedicated to helping fight against mass incarceration called Smart Justice. They aim to alleviate some of the struggles associated with prisoners' re-entry into society, as well as working hard to reduce the United States jail and prison population and fix racial inequalities in the American justice system. Supporting their campaign will help fund crucial legal battles and advocacy work that challenge unjust policies and practices. You can also contact your local representative to voice your concerns and push for legislative changes. Just because you can't vote yet doesn't mean that you can't make an impact on politics. Our representatives work for all of us, not just people that can vote. Writing letters and making phone calls can help to ensure that our voices are heard. Advocating for policies that reduce mass incarceration, improve prison conditions, and eliminate private prisons can influence our politicians' priorities and lead to actual change. When you are able to vote, make sure to vote for leaders who are committed to ending the privatization of prisons and replacing them with humane, rehabilitative approaches to imprisonment. Finally, we can reflect on our own attitudes and behaviors towards incarceration and justice. Understanding the complex factors that contribute to criminal behavior and recognizing that prisoners are human too can create a more empathetic and informed perspective in you. By having a more compassionate outlook, we can contribute to a cultural shift that prioritizes rehabilitation over punishment and prioritizes the common good over profit.